it was a video of Michael Jackson, and it showed the transformation of his face over the course of his life. It was just a couple second video. I didn't want to show it this morning because I was afraid it might disturb some of you a little bit. But in the video, you see Michael Jackson's progression from a really attractive young black teenager to what looks almost like a white woman with just a really kind of cartoonish nose. And I don't know if you've ever seen how he looked in his life, but he definitely modified his face. You know, you see this rapidly changing nose, rapidly changing jaw, and it's really crazy to think about the forces that would lead a person to make those sorts of decisions, to go under the knife and have their body modified in ways that are kind of disturbing. And so at the end of the video that I saw, someone had written the question, if that's what's going on the outside, what's going on the inside? And I think it's a fair question, and it's a fair question for us as we think about the pressures to conform to the beauty standards of the world, to the way that we get our identity from the way that other people see us. You know, rather than getting our identity as children of God, we compare ourselves to one another. And we are jealous of the way people look, you know, the way that the TV tells us to look, for instance, or the way that we want others to see us. And so what's going on the inside, I think, is a fair question. You know, and it's a fair question in our world where we see so many things just forcing us into a mold. Let me take a second here. Technical difficulty. I've had some technical difficulties this morning. That thing with the computer I've never seen before, so I don't even know what that was. So I appreciate your patience as I go into this default mode here. So anyway, Hollywood has an image of perfection, and it's an unrealistic image of perfection for most people. Probably 99% of people will never fit into the stereotypical body shapes that the actors in Hollywood, sell us as this way that we should look or act or behave. And so we're constantly bombarded with images of people who are thin, unhealthily thin, have perfect, symmetrical faces, or, have you ever seen like a beer commercial? You see all these people and they're just toned bodies, they just kind of sell you this lifestyle. And so much of what we get in media is trying to sell us a lifestyle, trying to sell us a way of thinking that if we never think about it, if we never compare it to like God's standards, can be very destructive. It can set us down a wrong path where we're getting our identities from each other, and we're being shaped by these forces that are sick, really. So in Reader's Digest, which is really a funny magazine, I'm sure many of you have seen before, there was this quote, there was this kind of a joke section about this kid who was there was a science teacher, and one of the questions on the test was, what is the purpose of the skin? And a child answered, to keep the people who look at you from throwing up. I guess in a roundabout way, I guess that's kind of what my sermon's about. We're not to read too much into these things about what people think of us. I mean, I can tell probably many of you are disturbed by the fact that I'm wearing a t-shirt and jeans and preaching right now. But it's so easy. It'd be so easy for me to come here in my bow tie and my fancy cowboy boots and preach probably what would seem like a really hypocritical sermon to a lot of people. So I let God pick my wardrobe today, something simple, something that's got no pretensions. And I can see so many of you who come up to me and greeted me this morning kind of looking like, are you preaching in that? What are you doing? Is someone else preaching today? But it's so easy to be shaped by those opinions of what people think of us, to let those make our decisions for us, and to be controlled by fear rather than by by love, by seeing our identity as children of God. And so I come before you with the closest thing to a quiet and beautiful spirit that I can muster this morning in my t-shirt. And I hope you can forgive me for that. You know, in last week we talked about submission to authorities and how hard that is and how hard the context that is for Peter's audience. But here Peter's talking kind of about other authorities, you know, cultural standards like we have today that are sick, that are against what God has for us, and not to be conformed by those unhealthy expectations and molds that society had. Now, our society is radically different than Peter's was. But to pretend that those cultural forces aren't out there shaping our decisions and recreating us into an image that's other than God would have for us is really naive to think that. You know, and Peter, he gives us this household code. And we talked about this as I preached through Colossians. Often when you see women mentioned in the Bible, then the next thing about women submitting, you see something about slaves submitting, and you see this classist breakdown of things in the Bible. And that was because in the society that the Bible was written, it was a patriarchal society, apart from the Greco-Roman world. And so what you see is this household code that explains how Christians in different classes should get along together. Because it's so hard to love someone when society's telling you that they're of no value because they're in a different class than you. And so just like if I was to quote the Declaration of Independence to you and I changed parts of it, you would recognize exactly what it is that I'm doing. You would recognize that I'm quoting something that is very familiar. And in the old days, Aristotle had a household code. It was a very brutal household code by any standard. You know, a husband could beat his wife to death, for instance, with zero social repercussions. You know, there was a person who was the head of the household, or the paterfamilias, and this person had the power of life and death over everyone in his family. And even if you didn't have a family, people would recreate these same sorts of social conventions. Like street people would recreate a household code for their situation. And so in the New Testament, you see the authors of the Bible using this common convention and changing it in significant ways. So here in this household code, you see rules, for instance, for the husband. You would never see those sorts of rules in Aristotle's household code. It's just, so this is a redemptive thing. It's so easy for us to look at the letter of the law on a passage about how women should submit to men and to read, to try to force that sort of cultural expectation into our culture and fail to see that what's really happening in the text is a radical thing where they're saying they're giving a household code like Aristotle would give, and then they're turning parts of it on their head, giving responsibilities to a husband. And even though our culture has progressed so much more than maybe it did in that time, you know, we're doing ourselves a disservice by saying, you didn't go far enough, Peter. You didn't go far enough, Paul, in changing this household code in a redemptive way. You didn't go as far as our culture has and as far as our standards should be. But we're talking in a society where it was really the only person who had any rights was the paterfamilias. And everyone else was way down. So it's into this context that you see these passages and these class conventions. And it's a fair question to wonder if this is something that's prescriptive for our time or it's descriptive of their time. If it's something that people in the Bible were trying to use redemptively, or if it's something that we should take on ourselves. You know, so our society has changed. So it's a fair question as you interpret the Bible to ask, is this something that we need to follow? Is this something that we are supposed to do? And it's a fair question to interpret the passage this way, to think in those terms. It's not a hatred for Scripture that would say, no, I think that's from the past. That's part of a Greco-Roman household code. That's not part of our society. It doesn't really apply in the same ways it did to them. Because to argue that it does, in many cases would be to argue that we should just bring back slavery. Because that's how it worked in the family of God, between wives and slaves and all these other things. So, you know, you can't just keep parts of it that you like. This isn't something that's rooted in the Leave It to Beaver sort of patriarchy, the soft patriarchy of the 50s. This is something that's rooted in a really cruel patriarchy from Aristotle's day. So, with Romans looking at persecuting Christians also, it wouldn't have been fitting for the biblical audience to challenge these household codes, because Christians were already seen as people who are marginalized by society, as atheists, really, as people who were to be oppressed, like Peter's day. So trying to radically transform social customs, I don't think would be fitting in this context. So Peter works with what he has, and he gives these husbands rules to follow, and he turns the table on this cultural convention. So, I think the answer is no. I think that we shouldn't try to force the culture of the Bible onto our culture in this way. I think that our culture has progressed farther than this in ways that the biblical writers would have embraced fully and been very happy about. It's hard to talk into it to get a sick society to conform in ways that are far beyond it. But to nudge a little bit of a baby step, I think, is something that they're trying to do here. And so, this is a scripture that's written in the context of wives and husbands. And the wives in this case, you can see clearly from the text that it was to the wives of unbelieving husbands. And it was trying to get them to think about how their conduct affected that relationship. How they could maybe, through actions that were holy and pleasing to God, they could maybe have a chance of winning their husbands over to the faith. That's really the context of this household code that we find. And so, living out your faith in a difficult circumstance is what Peter's advocating, and he's talking to these women and these husbands too. And so, there's a Japanese proverb that I really like, and it says, "The reputation of 1,000 years can be ruined by the conduct of a single hour." And I think that's the call to holiness for us today, to think about how our actions have repercussions and how we can seek to live a holy life in a way that's redemptive and honest, and that we can let the conduct of every hour be something that can really meet the challenges of that day. And I think it's fair to say that women aren't the only ones who get their identities from how people see them. I think that they maybe struggle with it a lot more than some men do, but we do the same thing. We often get our identities from being perceived as powerful or being perceived as a good provider. But it's the same sort of cultural mold that forces us into trying to be seen a certain way, into getting our identities from the people around us and comparing ourselves in a pecking order to the people around us, rather than thinking about being children of God. So we collect different kinds of status symbols. Maybe it's a fast car, or a garage full of tools, or even in my case, a giant library full of books. They're status symbols for us. It's so easy to get our identity from these symbols of status, rather than letting us be transformed in the image of God. And it's the same word for submission that Peter uses. This is actually a continuation of the passage from last week about submission to authorities. The same word for submission is that word hupatasso, which is to line up underneath. It's a military term to take on the yoke of a leader and follow their orders. St. Augustine wrote, "Since love grows within you, so beauty grows. For love is the beauty of the soul." And I think that's a hard thing for us to think about in a time where we just look at the outside, we look at the superficial for all of our definitions of what beauty is. Rufus Jones was a Quaker, he was kind of a Quaker philosopher, and he gave a talk one time about being lit from within. And this lady came up to him after his talk, and she had a really plain face, and she said, "Well, what about me? What about people like me?" And Rufus Jones said to her, "Well, I found that whatever face you have, no matter how plain it is, that as long as it's lit from within, it can be beautiful." And this woman kind of went away angry at Rufus Jones for not telling her practically what she should do. I think a lot of us can find ourselves in that sort of trap. We're not satisfied with adorning our hearts for God. We want to adorn ourselves in ways that are pleasing to others. and so we have a narrow definition, maybe a limited imagination of what beauty is, and it's not helpful to us. You know, being a father of two daughters and two very young daughters and watching them grow up, knowing that someday they will be completely objectified as women by most of the men in their life is a frightening thing for me. You know, I dream of a new kind of civil rights movement where my daughters wouldn't be judged by the letter of their cup size, but by the content of their character. And it's hard. It's going to be hard for me to see this transition because it's so easy in our society. I mean, commercials, TV, everything. And I was a construction worker. I've seen this at play in just its naked form, but objectifying women is really something that we're taught to do. We see women something as like a decoration at best, and sometimes just an object of desire, an object of our lust that's created solely for the pleasure of men. And women can get their identity from that, and it can lead to very destructive things, like bulimia or going under the knife to be changed so that they can look a certain way. They get their identity from being beautiful. And men do the same thing. Men get plastic surgeries too. Men do things like take steroids or work out countless hours at the gym to try to look a certain way. It's not just women who struggle with these things. And so there's a lady named Angela Bismarcky, and she was a Brazilian supermodel. And I remember reading about her. And she was not the person with the most plastic surgeries in the entire world. She was the second less most plastic surgeries in the world. She had actually married two different plastic surgeons over the course of her life, to probably because they had what she wanted. They had the power to change her body, and she's celebrated as a hero, really, as a supermodel. And she's put herself under the knife so many times that it's just nothing to her to have a radical surgery on her body. And in the article I was reading about her, she was getting ready for a song that came from Japan. And so she was getting these nylon wires put into her eyes to make herself look Asian. And for someone like Angela Bismarcky, having surgery is something to be taken on about the same level as changing the color of your lipstick at that point. 42 different surgeries. But she's celebrated as a supermodel. You know, this is the sort of extremes that we see in our society, where people are willing to go under the knife to be physically changed away from how God created them to be, not settling for that, thinking He made a horrible mistake, and taking matters into their own hands. Nearly all the movie stars and things that we kind of worship in our society, they're all people who, a lot of them have done this. I mean, look at Vanna White. Have you ever seen Vanna White on TV? She looks like she did 25 years ago. You know, how is that possible? I can tell you how. She invested a lot of money in plastic surgery, and she's still celebrated as a cultural icon. So it's easy for us to glamorize these things, to completely miss that they're sick. They're conforming us to something. And the Michael Jackson video, it's naked. You can see how distorted and sick this really is. But when it comes from Hollywood, when it's all glamorized, it looks like a sexy thing. It looks like something that we should all want. It's sold to us as a lifestyle. And we don't even think about it. We just consume it. So our brokenness is celebrated in our society. You know, bulimia and anorexia is the ticket to success for a lot of supermodels and people who are actors. You know, people take steroids to get a job on TV. And we all struggle, I think, with vanity in some form or another. The struggle to compare ourselves with one another. We feed into Hollywood's narrow conception of who we are, and that kind of body type that only like 1% of the population could ever achieve. And so we're unsatisfied with how God made us, and so you can see that the statistics are rising, actually. And I want to read to you some statistics from 2012. And the most popular surgery in 2012 is breast augmentation. There were 330,000 surgeries, breast augmentation in the U.S. in 2012. 313,000 liposuctions. 150 156,000 abdominoplasties, whatever that is. I think it's a tummy tuck. 153,000 eyelid surgeries. 143,000 rhinoplasties. And women had 9 million of these surgeries. There was 10 million surgeries that year. Women had 9 million of those surgeries. And men had 1 million too. And then there's things like non-surgical things like Botox. Do you know what Botox is? Does anybody know what that is? They inject botulism underneath your skin so that it paralyzes your muscle to make you look better. I mean, if I could go back in time 50 years and tell people back then what people were doing today to their bodies, and if I told people that they were injecting botulism under their skin and stuffing their eyes with nylon wires, I think people would have looked at me like I was crazy. Because it's changed so much, but we're in this culture and we don't even think about it. We're kind of carried along with the thought of the cultural soup that we're in. In the Old Testament, there's this giant sign of idolatry. Probably the biggest sign of idolatry is the golden calf. And the golden calf, if you're familiar with the culture in the time, was actually made out of earrings and nose rings that they got from Egypt. And earrings and nose rings back in that time weren't symbols of beauty and adornment solely like they are today. They were actually symbols of slavery. So how do you mark your slave? You put an earring on them or a nose ring on them so you know that this is a slave, this is not just a normal person. And so for the children of Israel to take all of these golden rings and these symbols of slavery and to make an idol out of them is just crazy, isn't it? You know, it's so easy for us to fall into that sort of idolatry. I want to show you a picture, if you would advance the slide forward there. This is called Johari's window. And it's kind of a way of thinking about what you know about yourself. And in the first box on the left is something that you know yourself and that's known to others. This is the social identity that you have. And on the right box at the top, it's something that's known to others but not to you. In the bottom left corner, it's something that's known to others and not known to others and known to you. So this is the hidden person of the heart. This is how Johari is kind of quantifying the part that this sermon is really supposed to be lived out today. And then in the box on the far right is something that's not known to you and not known to others at all. This is completely something that's only known by God. And I think we focus only on that top green box, the open box. Think about our social lives, things like Facebook make us think more about this than we might otherwise. But only God sees us for the whole picture. Only God sees all these parts of us at the same time. And so the hidden beauty of the heart, what is it like to live our lives in a way that we care more about this hidden side of ourselves, this side that only God sees, and less about the side that other people care about us? What does it look like to adorn this side of ourselves? As we go on in the text, it talks about a quiet spirit. And this in the text isn't actually a word that is used in a submission sort of a way. The word for quiet isn't like keep quiet and only speak when you're spoken to sort of quiet. It's actually a quiet meaning tranquil, like a pond. That we would be like a pond when someone throws a stone in and there'd be a slight ripple, and that's it. And so it's called to women to be tranquil, to be not led by fear, but to be tranquil in the presence of this adversity that they face. And then Peter harkens back to the example of Sarah calling Abraham Lord. And this is something that if you just take a topical reading of the text, you don't really see the context of what Peter's hinting at here. In Genesis 38, you see this conversation between Sarah and Abraham. And the whole conversation is about the birth of their son Isaac. It's the only time in the Bible that Sarah calls Abraham Lord. And in the context, basically, Abraham heard from God that they were going to have this son in their old age. And came to Sarah and told her that they were going to have this son, and she just laughed out loud. She didn't believe it. And then later on, as she got pregnant, they had this conversation, and she denied laughing. She denied that she had laughed. And so God is, Abraham's speaking for God to Sarah, and Sarah doesn't, she laughs, she rejects the message. And so then she calls him Lord after she finally believes the message. So this isn't just the kind of relationship you'd find between a lord and a slave that's he's being hinted at here. In fact, Sarah's name means princess. So already in the biblical story, you see this kind of idea of her being lifted up as a princess. It's like the submission between a king and a princess. It's a lot more equal than it would be otherwise. And so you see here Peter's call to treat husbands to treat their wives as co-heirs. And I want to read verse 7 in the complete Jewish Bible because it really hints well at what's going on in the Greek of the sentence. You husbands likewise can conduct your married lives with understanding. Although your wife may be weaker physically, you should respect her as a fellow heir of the gift of life. If you don't, your prayers will be blocked. And that's really what Peter is saying to these husbands who might have the mistaken assumption that because they're stronger than their wives, because they're physically stronger, because they have a higher class than their wives, that they could see their wives without love. They could use that as a justification to control and make their wives submit to their will. And so it's actually, Peter reminds us, it's actually negative. It can impact our spiritual life negatively to think in these terms, to subjectify our wife and think that just because we're stronger, we are superior to them. There was a man who started Promise Keepers. I don't know, have any of you been to Promise Keepers? The guy who started Promise Keepers was a guy who really wanted to be a holy man. He studied his Bible daily, tried to be a holy man. He tried to learn Greek and Hebrew and study his Bible to be a holy man. He was the kind of guy who checked off all these boxes about his relationship with God. He was really legalistic, actually. And one day, a man came to the church that he was at and was talking about living a holy life. And this is the kind of guy that just waited for a test, to kind of pass this test to live a holy life. And so the speaker that day actually gave out a test that you could check yourself to see if you're living a holy life. He said, I want you to turn to your wife, and go ahead and turn to your wife if you have a wife. Turn to your wife and look at her face, and if she's smiling, chances are you're a holy man. Yeah, that was the test. But this guy who started Promise Keepers, when he was doing the test, he looked at his wife, and she was actually crying. She wasn't smiling. The ways that he had been trying to live a holy life didn't translate into the ways that showed his wife that he loved her. And he was very convicted by that and started this whole ministry to try to teach men how to love their wives in a way that they can understand, to live a holy life in your marriage in that way, and in how you treat women, and how you think about sex, and how you think about all these things. And so we're called as Christians to love others as an extension of our love for God. If we claim we love God and we don't love one another, whether that's your wife or your brother or your sister or your children or whoever it is, if you claim that you have this great relationship with God, but that doesn't translate into tangible love that can be known and felt and appreciated in the ways that people receive it and understand it, then you're missing something crucial in the Christian life. So how a man treats his wife has a direct reflection of his relationship with God. And in a negative way that you live that out can affect your relationship with God. God won't listen to your prayers, Peter's saying, if you're not living in love to your wife. So we're designed for this kind of interdependence and to see each other as co-heirs, like Abraham and Sarah did. We're to live with our wives in ways that are understanding, looking to meet their needs, even if society tells us they're just an object of sex, just an object of beauty. We're to look at our wives and the women that God puts in our lives as sisters in Christ, and to love them for who they are and how they were created to be and how they're serving the Lord, and the inner beauty of the heart. Not just the way they look when they're all decked out in high heels and nines and going to a show or something like that. So as a husband, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to getting a PhD in physiology. I'm studying how to love this one woman with everything that I have in a way that she can know and tell that I love her. That's really what Peter is calling us to do, to let holiness come into this relationship. There's no room in this passage for domestic violence. In fact, a lot of this probably came because Peter was trying to combat domestic violence in his time. There's no room in this passage for chauvinism or thinking that just because you're strong or society tells you that you're a dominant force, that you are somehow better than all women that God put in your life. So whether you're 9 or 90, I think it's fair to say that we all struggle with this identity crisis of where we get our identity. Whether we choose to get that identity as being children of God, or whether we get that from how we compare to others in a social pecking order. A pecking order that has to do with class, status symbols, how we look, what people think of us. And God calls us to such a higher standard than that. To adorn ourselves, our hearts for God. So where will you get your identity from? The cold and callous social mold that the world has, or from your loving Father who created you just as you are and calls you to greatness? So gold doesn't last forever, diamonds don't last forever, the technological trinkets that we have won't last forever. Symbols of status will fade away. But exalting God in the hidden parts of your life is something that will be appreciated forever. So as we go into this time of open worship, I just encourage you to let God lead you, to think about who it is that God is creating you to be, and what it means for you to adorn yourself, to adorn the inner chambers of your heart in a way that glorifies God. If you feel led to speak, stand, and a microphone will be